So today's lecture is about skin layers and the cells that make up those layers. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the epidermis. The epidermis is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. So there are some of those words from last unit. Keratinized, meaning that it has keratin in it, the protein that makes it tough. Stratified, meaning that it comes in layers. And then, of course, squamous, we know, are flat cells. And when you look at the epidermis, besides just epithelial cells, there are also distinct cell types that pop up. There's 4 different ones. And then those cells, along with the epithelial cells, are arranged in 4 layers for some skin, 5 layers for other. So the cell types that we see are keratinocytes, melanocytes, Merkel cells, and the 4th one are called the Langerhans cells. So let's take a minute and talk a little bit about each one of these cells and what they do. So our keratinocytes, that's what most of our epidermis is made of. So when you look at the epidermis, the cells that make it up, the bulk of them are going to be keratinocytes. And just looking at their name, you kind of get an idea that their job is to produce keratin. And of course, we know keratin is what gives our skin that protective property so that it can withstand abrasions and bumps and scratches, things like that. Each one of those cells are tightly connected to one another by a cell junction called a desmosome, which allows those cells to be able to pass things along to one another, and it keeps them connected to the rest of the cells. Keratinocytes are made down in the very deepest layer of the epidermis, and through the process of mitosis, they divide. So as you produce new cells, the new cells push the ones that were there previously, the older ones, up. And then new cells are formed again and pushes those older cells even further up until eventually at the very top of the epidermis, you would find the oldest keratinocytes that you possess. And the newest ones are always going to be found at the very base of the epidermis. So keratinocytes at the base of the epidermis are living cells. They have organelles, they have functions, they do what they're supposed to as a typical cell would. But as they move up towards the top of the skin, the inside of that cell becomes mainly keratin. Eventually, it chokes out the rest of the cell's contents until it's nothing but keratin. So by the time that they reach the top of the skin, they're dead cells. And throughout the day, we rub off millions of these. Matter of fact, 1 month or a little farther, a little longer from today, the epidermis that you look at will be completely new because you will have flaked off all of those dead keratinocytes and made completely new ones. One thing that our skin does for us is that in areas where we have a lot of friction, like maybe the back of your ankle if you wore some new shoes, or your hands if you rake the yard, something like that, where you have friction, something rubs on your skin, it will eventually stimulate more cell production and more keratin to be formed, which causes the skin to have a thick area form, which is known as a callus. So if you look at this picture, all of the tan cells at the bottom, they're kind of puffy looking, and as you move up, you see they get flatter and flatter and flatter till eventually they're really flat at the very top. Those tan cells, those are all of our keratinocytes. The next cell is known as a melanocyte, and the name melanocyte tells us that it has something to do with the pigment melanin. And melanocytes are spider-shaped cells, and their job is to produce that pigment. They're found in the very bottom of our epidermis, and the cool thing about them is when they make their melanin, they send the melanin out in these little grains, these little granules, and they travel through the epidermis until eventually it gets picked up by a keratinocyte. Now, keratinocytes that are still living, they have DNA in their nucleus, and that DNA needs to be protected from the UV radiation, because if UV radiation hits that DNA, it can cause a mutation, which would lead to skin cancer. Well, by putting the melanin over the nucleus, it causes the UV radiation to be lessened, so not as much goes into the nucleus, so it protects the DNA. Oops. So if you look at this picture right here, those gray colored cells down here at the bottom, these are your melanocytes, and you'll see kind of how they have these spider arms that extend up through the keratinocytes. These little dots that you see, those are melanin, melanin pigments, and there are a lot of them up through here as well too. Okay, so the Langerhans cells, these are star-shaped cells. They're actually made in the bone marrow, and they migrate up to the epidermis. They have a very important job, and that is to activate the immune system. If something gets into your skin, or you come in contact with something that could be potentially dangerous or could cause you to be sick, your Langerhans cells activate the immune system so that your immune system can get rid of whatever could be problematic to you. Langerhans cells kind of look like a starburst when you look at them under the microscope. So you can kind of see this blue cell has kind of a starburst quality to it. And those are helping with the immune system. The last cell are the Merkel cells. And Merkel cells are little spiky hemisphere-shaped cells, kind of like half moons. And they're found at the very base of the epidermis, right where the epidermis meets the dermis, so the epidermal-dermal junction. And for every one of the Merkel cells, you're going to see a sensory nerve attached to it, because the Merkel cell's job is to pick up the feeling of touch. So whenever something touches you, that pressure, the Merkel disc picks it up and it sends that message to the brain so that your body can respond as needed. So right here, this purple, that's your Merkel cell, and you'll see this is a nerve ending that is attached to the Merkel cell so that it can let your brain know what's happening. So those are the 4 cell types. So now let's talk about how they get arranged in the different layers. So this is the layer of the epidermis discussion. And so basically, your thickness of your epidermis determines the thickness of your skin. The thicker the epidermis, the thicker your skin's going to be. And some areas of our skin is very thick, like the palms, your fingertips, the soles of your feet. All of those are thick, and when you look at them, they actually have 5 layers. Thin skin, which would be everywhere else, they're missing one of those layers. Remember, a layer is called strata. And so all those little layers are also a little thinner that are left behind. So that's why we call it thin skin. So the layers of the epidermis are the stratum basal, the stratum granulosum, the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, and the stratum spinosum. So for each layer of the epidermis, you have a scientific name, which is stratum in its name. And then you also have just a layman's term like basal layer. Stratum actually is layer, and you know that from your vocabulary. So stratum basal is the basal layer. Stratum granulosum is the granular layer. Stratum corneum is the horny layer. Stratum lucidum is the clear layer. And stratum spinosum is the prickly layer. And yes, you need to know both names. It's important that you're able to tell me what the everyday name is as well as what the scientific name would be. On your test, you'll actually have a section that is called Which Layer Am I? And it'll have a description of that layer from the epidermis, and you've got to identify it. So here's a picture of the skin, and this is actually in that text that you have. I think it's right. I think it's the second page of the text. It shows this diagram, and it shows you the different layers of the skin in order. So we're going to start at the very bottom, the stratum basal, which is known as the basal layer. This is the deepest layer. So it's the very bottom of the epidermis, right along the dermis borders where you would find it. And it is literally one row of keratinocytes. These keratinocytes are going to be living. They're going to be going through mitosis. And sprinkled along them, you're going to find the melanocytes. And they're going to be sending their melanin up into the layer above it, which happens to be the stratum spinosum. So every now and then you'll see a Merkel cell that'll be sprinkled in there so that it has some touch receptors that can be used in this layer. The next layer up is the stratum spinosum, which is known as the prickly layer. It is several layers thick, and it has filaments that resist tension. Now, the reason why it's called the prickly layer or spinosum, when I see that, I think spiny. Well, at this point, the keratinocytes are starting to fill up with keratin, which means they're no longer that typical cell structure that you see. Instead, they're kind of irregularly shaped. And so they kind of have these weird spiky shapes to them. And so that's where it gets its name, stratum spinosum or prickly layer. It's because they kind of look spiny looking when you look at the layer of tissue. You're also going to find lots of melanin in this area because once again, you still have a nucleus with living DNA in it. So you have to make sure that that's protected. So we'll find melanin. And then Langerhans cells are going to be found here too because we want to be able to protect the rest of the body from anything that may get into it. So they will trigger the immune response if need be. The next layer is stratum granulosum, which is known as the granular layer. It is about 3 to 5 layers thick, and it changes its appearance big time. And it's because at this point, the keratinocytes go from being big, puffy structural cells to more irregularly shaped cells to now they have flattened out because everything inside of them has been taken over by keratin. So they flatten out, the nucleus is gone, and you begin to see the formation of 2 types of granules. There's keratohyalin granules that you're going to continue to form more keratin as you move towards the surface of the skin. And then you're also going to see lamellated granules. Lamellated granules are important because they are waterproofing mechanisms. They keep water from leaving the epidermis and they keep water from coming into the epidermis. And so lamellated granules just kind of keep us, our water levels regulated through the skin. The cells in this layer thicken and waterproof themselves just so they're more resistant to destruction. The next layer is the stratum lucidum. We get that name because of translucent, and it's because it's the clear layer. And you only see this layer in thick skin. So the palm, the soles of your feet, your fingertips, an area where you're going to be calloused, you won't see this layer in all of those other skin layers because if it's thin, lucidum is not present. But if it's thick skin, you will have this 5th layer, the clear layer or stratum lucidum. And lastly, we have the stratum corneum, which is known as the horny layer. And it gets that name because it's really tough. The stratum corneum is the outermost layer. It's made up of about 20 to 30 dead cell layers. So when you look at it, it's about 75% or 3/4 of your entire epidermis is going to be the stratum corneum. They're going to be keratin. Here you're going to see plasma membranes are really tough at this level, and it's to keep the skin from being penetrated or from sustaining abrasions or cuts, but also it's going to produce glycolipids, which are a type of fatty substance, which help to waterproof the skin as well. So our cells continue to flake off at this layer throughout our lifetime, and they've actually said that if we could contain all of the skin that flakes off of you, you would lose about 40 pounds of skin in a lifetime. And skin does not weigh that much. And so 40 pounds of dead skin is a huge amount of skin. But luckily on us, we have these little things called dust mites. And when we get finished talking, I want you to go over and Google what a dust mite looks like. But dust mites eat our dead skin cells and eat dust. And that keeps us from having skin accumulate everywhere around us. So here are the layers again. Stratum corneum is at the top, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basal. And remember, right here in the middle, that's where you would see stratum lucidum or the clear layer. So one way that you can remember the order of the skin layers is there's a little sentence that some students use to study by, and it's come, and then of course lucidum, let's get sunburned. Come, let's get sunburned. Corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basal. And so that'll kind of help you to remember them in order. And of course, remember basal's at the bottom, corneum's at the very top. So that leads us to the next major layer, which would be your dermis. The dermis is known as your hide. It is the second major skin region just below the epidermis, and it's not made of epithelial cells though. It is made of connective tissue. Very strong, very flexible, and it literally binds everything in your body together. People call it like a body stocking because it holds everything in place. The dermis is where you're going to find your nerves, your blood, your lymphatic vessels, hair follicles, oil glands, sweat glands. So if you cut yourself and it bleeds, you cut into the dermis. If you cut yourself and it hurts, you cut into the dermis. When you pull a hair out, you're pulling it out of the dermis. There are two layers to the dermis, the papillary and the reticular. So the papillary layer is made of areolar connective tissue, and it has these little peg-like projections that are called dermal papillae. I tell people they look a lot like plateaus. They're just like these little structures of tissue that come up almost like skyscrapers. They form like these little rectangular looking structures. There was an image of them on the video you watched in Unit 1, the Incredible Human Machine, that showed the papillae on the tongue. So they just kind of like these projections that poke up. And each one of those have capillaries, nerve endings, and touch receptors. The touch receptors are called the Meissner corpuscles. So you see these little peg-like projections. Now what's neat about those is because of those projections that stick up, it causes the epidermis to stick up in certain areas too, and it does it in these patterns that are known as epidermal ridges. And the ridges are found on your fingers, and you call them fingerprints. Fingerprints, their job is to increase friction so that we can hold things and that we can, text with our phone, we can write with our pencil. But those ridges are actually formed by the papillary layer at the base of the epidermis, the very bottom under the epidermis. Our ridges have been determined by our DNA. You started forming fingerprints at 8 weeks inside your mother, and your DNA is what determined what your fingerprints were going to look like. And of course, we know fingerprints because we think of crime solving or forensics. When you touch something, the oils on your skin and the ridges on your finger leave behind an invisible marker that can then be dusted with a very fine powder that allows us to pick up that fingerprint. And then that fingerprint will, of course, match to the person that has it because it's determined by your genetics. And so it's kind of neat to know that it's the papillary layer that's responsible for all of our fingerprints. The next layer is the reticular layer. This is the deepest layer of the dermis. It makes up about 80% of the thickness of the dermis. It's made of that dense, irregular connective tissue that we call the reticular tissue. It has along the line, or in that tissue, it has these little things called lines of cleavage. It's little separations that form in the reticular layer. And this is really important for surgeons because if a surgeon cuts you along your line of cleavage, you're more likely to heal. And when I say cleavage, we're not talking booby cleavage. We're talking about all throughout the bottom or all throughout the body. It's these little separations in the reticular layer that will heal a lot easier. So, obviously a surgeon is going to try to perform an incision somewhere where you're not going to scar too terribly badly, and then on top of it, you're not going to take forever to heal. So that's really important, especially if you're a plastic surgeon. One good example are cesarean sections. Women years ago that had a C-section, they did a vertical incision up and down across their abdomen, and it left behind a really angry looking scar, and it took a lot longer to heal. Now they do what's known as the bikini cut, which is a horizontal incision more towards the pelvic bone. It heals really quickly, and it leaves behind a very, very faint scar. So that would be an example of cutting along a line of cleavage. The reticular layer has a lot of collagen fibers to make it very strong, so it prevents jabs, prevents scrapes. And there's also one other cool thing about the reticular layer, and that's called your flexure lines. If you take your hand and look down at the palm of your hand and begin to slowly close your fist, you will notice that your skin folds inside your hand. Those folds are known as flexure lines. It's where the dermis has been tightly secured to structures underneath, usually the bones or the muscles in that area. And so what happens is when you fold, it folds a crease there so that you can completely close that structure. Without it, your hands wouldn't be able to close all the way. And so we find these at a lot of our joints. So your palms, your wrists, your fingers, behind your knees, your elbows, your ankles, places like that is where you would find a flexure line. There are two homeostatic imbalances that go along with skin layers, and I want to take a second and just talk about those. One is called a blister. A blister is where the epidermis and dermis are basically rubbed against till eventually they separate from one another. And when they separate, fluid fills up that separation and you get a blister there. Another one is called stretch marks. The scientific name is called striae. This is where you grow, or we see it a lot in teenagers when they're going through growth spurts, and we see it a lot in women when they're pregnant. Because they're growing and there's this extreme stretching, it tears the dermis and leaves behind like these little purple lines that are known as stretch marks. So that's it for this lecture. The next one will be on skin color, appendages, and functions, and I will see you then. Thank you.